Welcome to Kenya News Update today. I'm your host, and this is our World News Deep Dive. A major chapter in one of the most shocking political assassinations of the 21st century has closed. Tetsuya Yamagami, the man who killed former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, has been sentenced to life in prison. The verdict came down today, January 22nd, 2026, ending a legal process that began with that fatal shot in Nara back in July of 2022. But this story is about more than just a courtroom verdict. It's about the lingering shockwaves of that event, the motivations of a disillusioned man, and how it intersects with Japan's current political and energy landscape. We'll also connect these threads to a major geopolitical story unfolding between the United States and Africa. It's a debate about influence, aid, and perception in a rapidly changing world. Stay with us for the next 12 minutes. First, let's revisit the facts of the case. On July 8, 2022, Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving prime minister and a towering political figure, was delivering a campaign speech for a parliamentary candidate in the city of Nara. Security appeared lax, a point heavily criticized in the aftermath. Yamagami, then 41 years old, approached from behind. He was carrying a homemade firearm, crudely constructed from metal pipes and wood. He fired 2 shots. The second struck Abe in the neck and chest. Despite emergency medical efforts, Abe was pronounced dead hours later. Yamagami made no attempt to flee. He was subdued at the scene and immediately confessed. His motive, as he told investigators, was not political ideology in the traditional sense, but a deep-seated personal grudge. Yamagami believed his family was destroyed by Abe's grandfather, former Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, and by the Unification Church, which he claimed had bankrupted his mother through massive donations. He saw Abe as a prominent symbol of that church's political ties. The investigation revealed a troubled life. A former member of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, discharged after 3 years, followed by a period of unemployment and profound isolation. The homemade nature of the weapon, which cost him less than 10,000 yen to make, underscored his determination and the shocking vulnerability of a high-profile target. The trial was a national spectacle, balancing the demand for justice with a morbid public curiosity about the assassin's mind. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing the crime was premeditated, politically motivated terrorism that struck at the heart of Japanese democracy. The defense, however, painted a picture of a broken man driven by a specific, personal vendetta, not a desire to overthrow the state. They highlighted his mother's fanatical donations to the Unification Church, which reportedly totaled over 100 million yen, bankrupting the family. Yamagami himself stated in court that his target was not Abe the politician, but Abe as a symbol of the church he despised. This nuance became central. Today, the court delivered its verdict, life imprisonment. In its ruling, the panel acknowledged the gravity of the crime, the cold-blooded killing of a former leader, but also cited the defendant's background, his lack of a prior criminal record, and his expressions of remorse as factors against imposing the death penalty. The life sentence in Japan typically means a possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 10 years, though in high-profile cases like this, it often means incarceration until death. The reaction in Japan is mixed. For many, especially Abe's supporters in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the sentence feels inadequate. They argue that only the ultimate penalty can truly serve justice for such a brazen attack on the political establishment. Others see it as a measured, perhaps even merciful, judgment that considers the systemic failures and personal tragedy that created Yamagami. This leads us to our first major debate point: justice versus understanding. On one side, the argument is clear. Shinzo Abe was not just any citizen. He was a former prime minister, a global statesman, and a key architect of Japan's foreign policy for over a decade. His assassination was an attack on the very institution of Japanese democracy. To not apply the maximum penalty, the death penalty, sends a dangerous message that such acts will be treated with leniency. It fails to provide definitive closure for the nation and for Abe's family. The sheer planning involved, building a functional firearm, stalking Abe's campaign schedule, shows clear premeditation, not a crime of passion. The defense of a troubled childhood, while tragic, cannot be a universal excuse for murder, especially one of this magnitude. The state must uphold the absolute sanctity of the law and the safety of its public figures. A life sentence with the possibility of parole does not achieve that. On the other side of this debate is the perspective that seeks understanding, if not forgiveness. Tetsuya Yamagami's life story is a case study in systemic failure. A veteran struggling to reintegrate into society, a family destroyed by what many consider a predatory religious organization with deep political connections. His act, while horrific, was targeted and specific in its grievance. It was not a random act of terror aimed at civilians. The court's decision to choose life imprisonment can be seen as a mature acknowledgement that the crime, while heinous, emerged from a specific context of personal ruin, allegedly linked to powerful institutions Abe represented. It opens a necessary conversation about the role of fringe religious groups in politics and the social safety net for veterans and the mentally distressed. Applying the death penalty ends that conversation. It makes Yamagami a mere monster, rather than a symptom of deeper issues Japan must confront. The life sentence allows for reflection and, perhaps, a measure of societal accountability. Now, let's pivot to a seemingly unrelated but profoundly connected story emerging from Japan today. As the Yamagami verdict was being read, another major announcement was made. Japan is set to restart the world's largest nuclear power plant, the Kashiwazaki Kariwa facility, after a 15-year shutdown. This is a monumental shift. Following the 2011 Fukushima disaster, Japan idled all its nuclear reactors. The public sentiment turned fiercely anti-nuclear, but the economic and energy realities have forced a rethink. Russia's war in Ukraine sent global energy prices soaring. Japan, an island nation with few natural resources, faced a severe energy crunch and skyrocketing electricity costs. The pro-nuclear lobby, which never fully went away, regained its voice, arguing that nuclear power is essential for energy security and meeting climate goals. The restart of Kashiwazaki Kariwa, capable of powering over 20 million homes, is the clearest signal yet that Japan is committing to a nuclear future. This is where our narrative connects. Shinzo Abe was a staunch advocate for nuclear power. He pushed for reactor restarts against significant public opposition. His assassination removed one of the most powerful political voices for that agenda. Yet here we are, less than 4 years after his death, seeing his policy vision realized in perhaps its most dramatic form. It raises a question: has the tragedy, in a macabre way, removed a political lightning rod, allowing the pragmatic argument for nuclear energy to proceed with less heated opposition? Let's visualize this geopolitical energy shift. Consider the contrasting paths of two major economies since the 2011 Fukushima disaster. On one side, Germany. In the immediate aftermath, Germany, under Chancellor Angela Merkel, announced the Energiewende, a decisive turn away from nuclear power. The plan was to shutter all reactors and pivot to renewables. Fast forward to today, and Germany has indeed shut down its last nuclear power plant. Its energy mix now relies heavily on renewables, but also on imported natural gas, a vulnerability brutally exposed by the Ukraine war. Now, look at Japan. After Fukushima, it too shut everything down. Public fear was immense, but the economic pressure and strategic vulnerability have forced a dramatic U-turn. The restart of Kashiwazaki Kariwa symbolizes Japan's bet on a controlled, regulated nuclear future to ensure its industrial survival and strategic autonomy. This is a real-time experiment in national energy policy with global implications. This brings us to our second debate: security versus sovereignty in the energy domain. For Japan, restarting the world's biggest nuclear plant is a bold gamble for energy security. The argument is compelling. Japan imports over 90% of its energy. Reliance on Middle Eastern oil and LNG from volatile regions is a national security risk. Nuclear power provides a stable, domestic baseload of electricity that is not subject to global market whims or geopolitical blackmail. It's also low carbon, aligning with climate commitments. Proponents argue that the lessons of Fukushima have been learned, that safety regulations are now the strictest in the world, and that the economic cost of not restarting the reactors, in terms of high electricity prices for consumers and industries, is simply unsustainable. The Kashiwazaki Kariwa restart is a necessary step to keep Japan's economy competitive and its future secure. The counter-argument centers on sovereignty and risk. True sovereignty, critics say, means not being hostage to the latent risk of a nuclear catastrophe. The memory of Fukushima is not just about radiation. It's about the loss of control, the permanent displacement of communities, and the contamination of land and sea. Can any regulation truly guarantee safety against earthquakes, tsunamis, human error, or now, in an increasingly tense world, military threat? The massive public opposition that existed in Abe's time hasn't vanished. It may have been subdued by economic pain. By choosing the nuclear path, Japan is centralizing its energy production in a handful of massive, high-risk facilities, creating single points of failure. True energy sovereignty, this side argues, lies in a decentralized, renewable grid, solar, wind, geothermal, that is resilient, democratic, and inherently safer. Japan's restart is a step back into a risky, 20th century model of energy, not a leap forward into a secure 21st century one. Now, let's cross the globe and connect these threads of influence and perception to Africa. While Japan grapples with its internal demons and energy future, a diplomatic storm is brewing between the United States and the African continent. A leaked email from the new head of the U.S. State Department's Bureau of African Affairs, sent this January, has ignited fury. The email, obtained by The Guardian, instructed U.S. diplomats to unabashedly and aggressively remind African governments of the generosity of the American people. This directive comes at a time when U.S. foreign aid is facing significant cuts. The tone of the email has been widely condemned as paternalistic and, by some African diplomats, as outright racist. It dismisses Africa as a policy priority while simultaneously demanding gratitude. This incident exposes a raw nerve in U.S.-Africa relations at a critical juncture. Global powers like China, Russia, and even Turkey and the Gulf states are actively deepening their economic and military ties across the continent. The U.S. message, as perceived from this leak, seems out of touch and counterproductive. Let's put some numbers to this perception gap. We often hear about U.S. aid, but let's look at the scale and context. For instance, U.S. military aid and security cooperation in Africa has seen certain allocations. However, when we talk about influence, we must consider the broader picture of investment and trade. The leaked email's framing suggests a transactional relationship where aid buys loyalty. But many African nations are increasingly looking for partnerships, not patronage. They want technology transfer, equitable trade deals, and investment in infrastructure and manufacturing, not just humanitarian handouts. The language of reminding them of generosity feels like a scolding parent, undermining the partnership the U.S. says it wants. In an era where African nations have more suitors than ever before, this approach risks pushing them further into the arms of competitors who, rightly or wrongly, offer deals without the moral lecturing. This leads to our final debate: aid as influence versus partnership as strategy. The traditional U.S. view, seemingly reflected in that leaked email, is that foreign aid is a tool of soft power. By being the generous donor, the U.S. earns goodwill, shapes policy preferences, and maintains a network of allied governments. In this model, it's perfectly logical to remind recipients of the benefactor's generosity to ensure continued alignment. The aid, even if reduced, is a lever of influence. From Washington's perspective, in a budget-constrained environment, they need to maximize the diplomatic return on every dollar spent. The message to staff might be crude, but the underlying logic is realpolitik. Make sure our investment in these countries pays political dividends. The alternative view, increasingly held across Africa and by a new generation of diplomats, is that this model is obsolete and offensive. True partnership is not transactional, it's strategic and mutual. It involves listening to African priorities, which are often job creation, industrialization, and climate resilience, and aligning investments accordingly. It means treating African nations as sovereign equals in negotiating trade pacts, not as aid recipients to be managed. The backlash to the email highlights this shift. African leaders are less willing to accept strings-attached aid when other partners offer investment without public condescension. A partnership strategy would see the U.S. leveraging its private sector, its universities, and its technology to create win-win scenarios, rather than using dwindling aid budgets as a blunt instrument for influence. The future of U.S.-Africa relations depends on which model wins out. So, what do these stories, a Japanese assassin's life sentence, a restarted nuclear Goliath, and a diplomatic email faux pas, have in common? They are all about legacy, power, and the tension between past actions and future directions. Shinzo Abe's legacy is being shaped by both his killer's sentence and the realization of his nuclear policy. Japan's energy future is a bet on centralized power to ensure sovereignty, a debate mirrored in nations worldwide. And the U.S. faces a reckoning in Africa, where its past approach of aid as influence is colliding with a continent demanding respect and partnership. In each case, institutions and nations are struggling to adapt narratives to new realities. The Yamagami verdict tries to close a traumatic past while acknowledging its complexities. Japan's nuclear restart looks to a pragmatic, if risky, future by revisiting a rejected past. And U.S. diplomacy must decide whether to cling to an outdated script of generosity or write a new one based on mutual interest. The world in 2026 is not a clean break from 2022 or 2011. It's a layered story where yesterday's events, decisions, and tragedies continuously reshape today's headlines and tomorrow's possibilities. For Kenya News Update today, this has been a World News Deep Dive. We've presented the debates, the numbers, and the connections. The analysis is yours to continue. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for more.